My name is Sean Brown. I'm from the class in 1994. Let's hear it for the class in 94. Got some good people there. And welcome to our, in case you were wondering, this is the session on maximizing personal productivity. So if you're in the wrong room, you're probably already behind the curve on the personal productivity thing. And it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Bob Pozen. Bob is a senior lecturer at MIT Sloan and Harvard Business School, as well as a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. We're pleased that he's with our reunion today instead of that other one up the river. Bob served as executive chairman of MFS Investment Management from 2004 to 2011, during which time their assets under management doubled to over $250 billion, which seemed like a pretty big number. He also served in various roles at Fidelity Investments, including as president of Fidelity Management and Research. Bob also served in a number of SEC and federal and state leadership roles and was the recipient of the 2011 Fund Action Lifetime Achievement Award for his work in the mutual fund industry. So clearly he's very productive. He's also published 7 books and written multiple editorials for the Financial Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. He will also be teaching an executive education program for those in the Boston area on personal productivity on July 15th and 16th and November 20th and 21st. Bob received his bachelor's from Harvard and a JD and doctorate from Yale Law School. Please join me in welcoming Bob Pozen.
Thank you. Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. Can everybody hear me? So he left out my career as a stand-up comedian, probably because it was very short-lived. So I hope you'll help me by laughing at my jokes. And if you don't get them, I'll identify them as jokes, just to make sure that you know that they're that. So let's see if we can get this to work. So let's start with the basics here, and that is, why are we still talking about time? Why are we still talking about hours? My basic thesis is what's important is not the hours that you put in work, but what you get done. And why are we still talking about hours? Well, at one point talking about hours made sense because in a, say, factory assembly line context, probably hours was a good proxy for what you got out. But we all work in a knowledge economy now. So is there anyone here who thinks that hours put in is a good measure of productivity in a knowledge economy? Anyone want to take me on that one? So, okay, so then let's and I open this up to discussion. Hopefully you have volunteers. I also have been known to cold call. Just want to make you feel at home. So why, if everyone agrees that hours is a bad measure of productivity, why is it that we're still talking about hours? There are lots of businesses, lots of organizations that tell people they have to be in from 9 to 6. I'm not one of them. When I ran Fidelity, I had an equity analyst who came in at 6 a.m. in the morning, and she left at 10 a.m., and she was great. She got a lot of good stock ideas. Why should I care whether she stayed till 5 p.m.? That's what I was interested in. So why is it that we're still, I'm taking volunteers, why is it that we're still talking about hours at all? Why is it? Yes?
A lot of people get paid by the hour.
Well, but that's another, people get paid by the hour. So they have the whole group of people like lawyers, consultants, accountants. So they're hopeless. No, academics don't get paid by the hour. They get paid by the word of their peer review articles in the Journal of Economic Obscurity. We all know that. Not by the hour. But so we have to take those people who are paid by the hour and put them aside. They're hopeless, obviously. But the question is, what about all these other organizations? Yes?
I think because people are digitally tethered.
Digitally tethered? I don't know what the hell that means.
Always accessible.
Always successful.
Always accessible.
Accessible.
And because they're always accessible, there is no end-to-end day.
I see. Okay, but then we shouldn't care whether people are in the office 9 to 6. If they're accessible all the time, we should say they're on 24/7 always, right?
Well, that's why people see hours.
I see. Okay.
Always accessible.
Okay, yes.
Lack of trust.
Lack of trust. And I think that's good. Trust, especially of the boss. That the boss is worried that if these people aren't in the office, well, what the hell are they doing? Are they out fishing or are they doing some productive work? So that's one of the things. What else do you think makes people want to do hours. What, yes?
Well, there is some benefit to having your team at the office at a particular set of time.
Okay. Everyone hear that? Everyone hear that? So he said, there is some benefit in having your team at the office at a particular set of time. And you're absolutely right. I was thinking when you said that about Marissa Mayer, who, when she became head of Yahoo, she told no more telecommunicating, no more home. Everyone had to come to the office 5 days a week. But if I'm correct in understanding you, a more rational thing would be to have them come in on Mondays and Thursdays and get together. The notion that in California you're going to have everyone come into the office 5 days a week, that probably cuts off, you know, a good 10 hours of commuting time. I mean, adds another 10 hours commuting time. Anything else? Yes.
Lacking good metrics for knowledge.
Okay, well, that's very important. And I think a lot of the reasons why people are in hours is because it's easy to measure and it's really difficult to do something else. So, yes.
Time is the ultimate precious resource.
Time is the ultimate precious
It is the
resource.
scarcest resource.
Okay, that's a good one. That's a good one. So, what I'm trying to do is this, is to say, how do we get off a time-based system, having trust, having good metrics? And so I call it a performance-based system. And you can't go from hours to nothing because the organizations will revolt. You can't, and you've got to have some metrics. So I call it performance-based productivity, and it's pretty straightforward. First is you meet with your team, and you figure out what are your objectives and what are your priorities. And when people ask me, how do I define productivity? It's relative to whatever objectives you set up. I'm not trying to tell you what the objectives are. Your objective might be to become the best golfer in the world. It might be to run a business, whatever it is. So you set your objectives and you set your priorities, but then, as you say, you have to send your metrics. Because most objectives are too vague and actually people don't know what we're talking about. So take an example. If I have a team and say, by the end of the month, I want to improve customer service in this organization. So that's a perfectly reasonable objective. The question is, what do we mean? Do we mean fewer transaction errors? Do we mean phone time is shorter before we pick up the phone? Do we mean that people go out and see more clients? So by having this discussion on metrics, you actually do two things. One is you create a much more of a consensus about what the group is doing, and then everybody knows what's the measure of success. It's not hours, it's whether you have achieved these objectives, and we know what the metrics are by the end of the period. So that's a much better system, but it takes work up front. It takes a lot of work up front to really think about what your priorities are and what your metrics are for them. So I'm going to talk now just about the three main ideas in my book, Extreme Productivity. I got to put a pitch in for that, you know. And then we'll have time for question and answers, and then we'll talk about your day. And then if we have time, we'll talk about personal skills. So three big ideas. The first idea is pretty simple. You ought to write down your goals for different time frames. I usually ask people to write them down for the next year and then prioritize them. I was yesterday in Toronto, and somebody told me, oh yeah, I write my goals down all the time. And I said, well, do you prioritize them? They say no, so they just have a long list. Well, that's not that helpful. How many of you actually write down your goals for the upcoming year and prioritize them? So I'd say we have about 20%. So it's simple, I think. If you don't write down your goals and prioritize them, you're probably unlikely, you're much less likely to achieve them because you don't know what they are. And here's the thing that I often do is I send out surveys, and of course we couldn't send out a survey here because we didn't know exactly who was going to be in the class. But people ask them to put their priorities on the left side, 3 or 4, and then do a time allocation study. And here's the striking thing. For most people, less than half of their time is spent on what they say are their top priorities. So that clearly shows that there's a big mismatch And we have to understand, all of us, why that is true. But for most of us, it is true. I think the average is between 40 and 50% of your time is spent on what you say are your top priorities. So clearly, there's a big mismatch here. The other thing that's really striking is within the same sort of job, how much difference there is. And I gave a talk at a big bank in which I think everyone in the room, all 200 of them, were vice presidents, you know. If you were, and they all had roughly the same job, though of course they told me each one that their job was unique, but you know, since I've dealt with banks, I wasn't, you know, misled. And what was interesting is the range of hours that people put in was between 40 and 80. And for the same job, So I asked the people who worked 40 hours, I said, are you screwing off? Are you lazy? I mean, what's happening here? And they said, no, they're very productive. They're working very hard. They're doing a good job. And then you ask the people who are working 80 hours a week, why are you working 80 hours in the same job? And they say, I have to. That's always the answer. I have to. Why do you have to? Well, there's an emergency. And I said, there's an emergency every day? That's a lot. There's no one else who can do the job except me. That's a typical answer. And what happens when you get sick, by the way? Does the whole organization close down, or does someone actually do the job other than you? So, and then there are those people who I've come to believe actually don't like to go home. They actually they enjoy work. Maybe they have a lot of kids at home. Maybe they have teenagers who tell them off. I don't know, you know. But they actually feel better. Yes?
Folks who are judged by their superiors as hard workers or not so hard workers with promotions.
Yeah, and that's important, and I'm going to get to that, dealing with your boss. And so some people will just say, my boss demands it, my boss demands it. But again, I would say this, whether your boss demands it or not, in most cases is implicit, not explicit. And if you actually talk to your boss, you might find that it's different. For instance, when I was president of Fidelity, my kids all played on sports teams. So every Wednesday at 3:30, I used to leave the office to go to my kids' sports teams. And people were like shocked. And people were amazed. And people come up to me and say, you mean could I actually go early to go to my daughter's piano recital? I'll get my work done. And I said, of course you'll get your work done. You'll probably be more motivated to do it. And people just assume that the boss has this view. But you know, the boss is also an employee. The boss also has a boss. Every boss is an employee and a boss, right? So you'd be surprised if you talk to your boss and you show that you can get the work done by the metrics, no matter where you are, no matter what time it is, then what the hell do you care whether this person leaves at 3:30, they leave at 4 o'clock, they leave at 6 o'clock, these sorts of things. Okay, so the second thing is, why is it that there is this mismatch between your priorities and your goals and the way you use your time? And probably the biggest thing is people get bogged down in a whole series of things. So let's talk about some of them. So one is email. Does anyone here get too much email? So the question is, what the hell are we doing with all this email? I mean, we've gotten to the point where technology, which is supposed to help us, is overwhelming us. I mean, I, in any day, get several hundred emails, and I can tell you that most of them are not worth reading. I made the mistake of giving a candidate once a donation, and then your name gets on some list. And then people start soliciting you from Idaho, and you've never been to Idaho. And then it's worse. They have to tell you every day how well their campaign is going. You don't even know this person. Or you're like one of 5,000 people who are getting this email. You know it. It's just a standard email. Or you're being solicited by somebody you have nothing about, or you're something advertising, et cetera. So this is my view of email. This is what I suggest. First of all, you don't look at your email every minute. We see lots of young people going around like this. They walk around like this. And you look at your email once an hour and a half. Second of all, and this is tough, you've got to look at the subject matter of your email and immediately discard 50 to 75%. Just don't read it. You look at the subject matter, it's worthless. Take my word for it. It is worthless. Now, the third part is, what about those emails that are important? Well, those, I'm saying, Ohio, only handle it once. Actually, right then and there, respond to it. Why? Well, those people are important, so they like it, and you like it when they respond. And let's assume you don't do that. You put it in sort of holding pattern for whatever sort of can that you have. Well, then if you look for it later, it may take you another half an hour to find it. And worst of all, you'll forget about it. And if it was an email, say, from the IRS and you forget about it, well, that would be a problem. So my strong view is, if it's important, answer it right then and there. You'll get it done, you won't have to think about it, you'll move on, and everyone will think it's a good thing. A second area is the area of multitasking. So how many people here engage in multitasking? I assume everybody does, right? But if you look at the MIT Sloan Review, or you look at any academic stuff, they all tell you multitasking is bad. It decreases your productivity. And what do they mean by that? I think what they mean is you can't do two important tasks at the same time. So you probably should not try to fly a jet plane and solve a calculus problem at the same time. That's probably a bad idea. But there are lots of things that you can do together. I mean, to me, the best example is conference calls. How much real significant content is there in any conference call? I'm being generous, 20%. And the beauty of a conference call is no one can see what you're doing. So you can be doing all these other things. Nobody is offended. So there are lots of things. The question is, what do you pair together? So when you guys are driving a car, how many of you are listening to a book on tape? Is that okay? How many people would be okay with eating while driving a car? How about texting? How many people will be honest like me and say, I actually do text occasionally, though I try to convince myself I only do it at lights. But sometimes the light turns and I sort of keep texting. So one part of multitasking is to know which two functions to pair. The other thing that I've been impressed by is the social functions of multitasking. Now, if you were having a small meeting and someone brought out their iPad and started immediately going through their emails, would anybody be offended here? Would anyone? Raise your hands. Would you be offended? Lots of people would be offended. And some people wouldn't. So I've sort of surveyed this, and I can tell you we have no idea whether people would be offended or not. Because in some groups, people are very offended. I'm on several boards of directors of people, let's say, average age over 55, and most of those people are appalled if someone brings out an email and starts doing that during the board meeting. So we've talked about it, and we've come up with this rule. No emailing during board meetings, but we'll take an email break every hour. So that works. Now, I also work with a lot of small biotechs here, and people come like really with electronics, overload to these meetings. And people expect everyone to be on their electronics. In fact, the guy across from me, like you, he wouldn't talk to me. He'd only send me text messages. So the long and short of it is multitasking is a very important way to improve your productivity, but you've got to pair the right functions. And second of all, you have to be sensitive to the social mores of the group as to what you're allowed to do. I mean, another thing is people sometimes come into my office and I know I'm about to get a call from a reporter who's on deadline. Now, if I do nothing and that call comes in and I pick it up, a lot of times the person will be offended. But if you say to them when they come in, look, I have a reporter who's on deadline, I might get called, would you mind if I picked up the phone? Everyone has always said yes. So it's a matter of really managing that social situation. Okay, now the other two things I want to talk about, I was on a Toronto TV show yesterday and the woman said to me, what about the two P's, perfectionism and procrastination. What she meant is, what about the things that are personal to you? It's easy to say that your boss is the one who's screwing you up from productivity, but I believe that most people internally are big constraints on productivity. So one thing is perfectionism. How many people would say that they're perfectionists? Let's have some hands here. So, sir, why are you a perfectionist? When did you become one?
Did I become one?
Yeah.
Sometime during the university years.
Your university. So was it your training in school that made you a perfectionist?
It was just, that's the only way I could succeed.
Only way you could succeed. Okay. Who else do we have as a perfectionist? Now, yes. So how did you become a perfectionist?
I was born that way.
He was born that way. I often hear this. This is a new gene called the perfectionism gene. We're working on it at the MIT labs, and we're trying to cultivate it and clone it. So it's a very difficult thing. Anyone else a perfectionist? Yes.
Say you become a perfectionist at school because you're required to get certain grades, right, to get to the next level, then to the next level. And if you don't get this grade, you don't get to MIT, right?
Okay, but it's not clear that being a perfectionist is the best way to get to MIT.
If you get bad grades.
Oh, yeah, if you get bad grades. So the question is being a perfectionist help you or hurt you in getting good grades? And I would say the answer is it depends. So I totally agree with you that for important things, you need to be a perfectionist. If you're taking a, geometry test in high school, you ought to get it right, get the detail right. If you're in a drug company and you're in charge of quality, you ought to get that right. But the difference is there are lots of things in our life which aren't worth being a perfectionist on. So almost every organization I've ever been in requires people to send in monthly or quarterly reports of their activities. I swear, most of them are never read. And if they are, somebody spends about 22 seconds on them. But some people can't help themselves. They have to write a 5-page report. They have to get the grammar right. They have to get the spelling right. And that's where the unproductivity comes in. So the simple answer that I have on perfectionism is do A work for A goals, but do B work for B goals. And if it's really a C goal, just skim. And if you're using a lot of time and a lot of detail for things that aren't worth it, then you are decreasing your productivity. Now we come to the other one, which is the most fun one, which is procrastination. So how many people here are procrastinators? So I've come to believe that everyone is a procrastinator. You know that? Is there anyone who's not a procrastinator? She's not.
Well, no, because in the language of technology, I am a late binding decision maker.
Oh,
And
excuse me. I couldn't call that procrastination. She's a late decision maker. So I would say there are two classes of procrastinators. One are the people, the late decision makers, let's call them. Late binding decision maker. Okay. So there are those people, and I've dealt with them in business and in academia, who if they have a big project, they can't get started till the day before the project is due. Now you're saying binding, you see, you're very careful because you're saying you're doing all this work, but you're not making the actual decision to the very end. So that's sophisticated. But the reality is that we have lots of people who can't start projects till the day before they're due. We have lots of people to do that. And I've encountered them in many places. And they can only react to the deadline. And some of them are very smart and they get away with it for many years. But as they go up the ladder, the tasks become more complex. And it really is hard to design a jet engine in 2 days. It's not easy. You really got to start a little earlier. So my view of that is if somebody only responds to deadlines, give them more deadlines. So if it's a month project, divide it into 4 weeks and have a deadline at the end of every week. Now, I think the more widespread problem is, and this is true of me, of everyone, if you have a boring and difficult task, most people try to avoid it, and they try to put it off. So you can do things like try to just get started. If it's a very large task, sometimes you're overwhelmed by it. You can divide it into parts. But the other thing I'm all in favor of is self-rewards. So the thing I do that's the most boring thing I do is correct exams now. I unfortunately teach 90 students, and they all write the same exam. If you've read the first 30, you really are ready to kill yourself by the end. You want someone to write something different, even if it's wrong. I mean, you try to read 4-hour exams, essay exams. You tried to read 50 or 60 of them. I tell you, it's a challenge. So after about 30, when I pretty much know every answer that's possible, I say to myself, if I do another 10, I'll treat myself to an ice cream. And if I do another 25, I can go and watch a movie. So these are little things, but I think are really important. So we all have to work on procrastination. As I said, some things are mechanical, like get started, divide it into parts. But I do think other things are to give yourself some self-rewards. Now, the third main idea that I have is, what about your really big projects? And here I have what most people think of as a counterintuitive idea. I call it start at the end. So what I mean is, let's take a big project, like you're working for, I don't know, a consumer products company, and they've decided they want to have a new manufacturing plant. And they want you to say where it should go, in whatever country it is, whatever place it is. So that's a big project. Most people will spend 3 months researching, et cetera, and then they'll come to the last week and try to synthesize it. And in my view, that's a very unproductive way to do it. Why? Because when they get to the last week, they'll realize two things. They'll realize that there are critical issues that they haven't come to grips with. And second of all, they won't have all the facts because they won't have focused enough. So I ask all the people I work with at the end of the second day of a large project to write down their tentative conclusions. Now, everybody I've ever done this with says, I can't do it. I won't know enough at the end of the 2 days. And the answer is they're wrong. Of course, they don't know the final binding decision, if I got it right. That's right. But they know the tentative conclusions. They're like hypotheses. They can sort of say, well, here are the sorts of factors that are really important for these locational decisions. Here's the sort of facts that I need. Here are the sort of people I need to talk to. And here are some hypotheses about what it is. So when you do that, you've immediately started to come to grips with the very tough questions, and every single project I've seen has tough conceptual questions. And second of all, you guide yourself in the research so that you're not looking at an infinite number of facts, you're looking at facts that are relevant to your decision. So this, of course, is tentative, and that's why I preach you have to have a mid-flight review, and you don't make a binding decision until the very end. And so you're not saying that you're trying to finalize this, you're trying to sort of organize it in a way that's going to make it more fruitful. So I'm going to stop here and take some questions, and then we'll go on to your day. And I'm going to take a little drink here. So do we have some questions here at this point? Yes?
Is there an interplay between procrastination and perfectionism? Because the perfectionist is so good at trying to be perfect on everything that it stops him to procrastinate on something new that comes along.
Well, that's a good point. I don't know if every perfectionist is a procrastinator, but surely persons who are perfectionists are going to use that for low priority tasks to be a procrastinator. So I would agree with you on that. Other questions, comments? Yes?
What if your boss is a procrastinator?
What if your boss is a procrastinator?
What you're presenting sounds good to him, but he said he can never know for sure, and so he waits it out.
He waits it out. Okay. Well, I'm going to talk a little more about your boss and about that whole issue, but basically, have you talked to your boss about the fact, is your boss a he or she?
It's a he.
He. So have you talked to him about the fact that he is delaying decisions, not just for binding decisions, but he's delaying them unnecessarily? Have you discussed that?
I was discussing it in terms of the project, not in terms of him being...
Oh, yes. Okay, so that's good. So you're not attacking the person, you're dealing with the project. And do you give him an alternative? See, one of the things I always preach is two things with the bosses is most people make assumptions about their boss, and if they talk to their boss about it, sometimes they're surprised that the boss isn't quite as crazy as they think he or she is. The second thing is, if someone comes to me and says, we have a problem without a solution, I really react negatively. My whole life is one big problem, you know? If you're running a $1 trillion organization, like Fidelity, we have $1 trillion under management, I mean, every day is a big problem, you know? Problem somewhere in the world. So I want to know a solution. So if you're going to, and as you see, probably properly so, you've got to say how you could do this differently that would be within reason and would come to a better result. So that's what I would say. Other questions? We have one more. Yes, two more. Here. Yes, you and then.
Sure. So at my company, if there's a large project and major decision, and if we followed your proposal there, whenever executive makes a tentative conclusion, let's say on the end of the second day, everyone who reports them will just cluster around that. So, oh, that's a wonderful idea. Let's just follow that because of national.
Well, I think that's actually a very important point. A very important point. If you're the boss, especially if you're a boss of a large company, people tend to give undue weight to what you say. And I remember, this is a funny story. I remember Ned Johnson was the chairman of Fidelity. He and I once were in a site where there was a big new retirement building. And he looked at this tree and he said, you know, I don't really like that tree there. And the next day, of course, people went through everything to get that tree out. It turns out it was on a water and a ledge, $250,000 to move that tree. So I said to him, you know, Ned, how much it cost to move that tree? $250,000. He said, I didn't mean that. I didn't mean that anyone should do that, you know? And so you got to be very careful when you're the boss. And you've got to put these things as tentative hypothesis.
But I'm not the boss. So how do you manage a boss?
Well, you got to, that's another, but the boss has to be willing to say, look, here's what I think, here are a number of alternatives, and what I want is a real honest discussion and analysis of what's the best answer. Now, if the boss doesn't do that and they say, well, there are a million alternatives, but actually the answer is X, well, then they're doing a bad job. And so you got to talk to them, and you can tell them that I told you that that's a bad way to do it. We had one more question.
Yeah, you focused more on kind of managing the abundance of email.
Right.
But why wouldn't we look to change the culture of email and the practices?
Well, I'm totally in agreement. So what would you do?
Get on the phone. Simple as that.
Well,
in one example, a simple example, but
Instead, people don't answer the phone these days. You notice that?
but you and I can go back and forth on 10 emails. I'm waiting for you to respond. You wait for me to
Yeah.
respond. I get to the phone, ask my question, you answer it, I clarify your response. We have a decision
Yeah,
to move on.
well, that's, so you can train people that for certain sorts of decisions, you want actual discussion. Another thing I would say, stop people from hitting the reply all button. That is the single most destructive thing in email. Yes?
One little suggestion on training. So I went to work for a company where it was just nuts in terms of the amount of emails. And so I literally set an automatic reply to say, I only check emails between this time and this time. And I want to say it took about a month. Everyone stopped emailing me. So they started, because if they wanted an automatic response, they would call. But I read in a book somewhere, but it actually ended up being really, really
Well, that's an interesting idea. Yes, sir.
So I get this, also getting this long conversation between emails. Yes, okay, give me more information, and it becomes more like a chat rather than an email. But I have to, I'm in contact with like a millennium generation, the younger people.
It's those younger people. They are all screwed up. They're not like us, you know. They're as bad as the boss, those younger people.
But they don't want to commit over phone. So
Oh, they don't want to commit over the phone, I see.
they want to have something like there's a trade that.
Oh, well, that's not crazy. Sometimes you really do want something, you know, you spend a half an hour on the phone with some AT&T representative and they tell you something, you say, send me an email and confirm that. So when my thing gets screwed up, that's not a crazy idea. It depends. So I think the critical things that we're seeing here is it depends on what the decision is, when you want to discuss things and when you want to sort of just have the confirmation. So I'm going to go on so that we don't run out of time here, and if I can figure out this. So I'm going to talk now about your daily routine and some of the things you could do to improve your productivity within that. So this is an example of my daily schedule. So most people will have this type of daily schedule on the left side. It's the right side that's different. And in the right side, what I'm trying to do is to take my priorities and translate them into my daily schedule. The problem is that most of us go to lots of meetings, we have conference calls, we do this, we do that, and at the end of the day, we say, well, what the hell did we accomplish? And we're not sure. And we can come home and say, I worked very hard, but I don't know what the hell we got done. And one way to combat that is to really write down, why are you going to this meeting? What do you hope to get out of it? And then maybe you'll have a chance to do it. The other thing about this thing is there are gaps. So this is the type of card about this big that every CEO that I've ever worked with uses. Yesterday, I was with the CEO of a very large Canadian pension fund, and he brings out his thing. And of course, there's no space that's not taken. And I said to him, where on your schedule is your thinking time? And of course, he laughs. I said, no, isn't thinking part of your job? And he said, well, I don't know, I'm very busily scheduled. So my view is you've always got to keep an hour in the morning and an hour in the afternoon open because you need to think. And the other thing is stuff happens that's unexpected, so you need to deal with it. Now, let's see, I'm still working on this technology. So another thing is, what about your daily schedule in the physical sense? So how many people here sleep 4 to 5 hours a night? How many people? Okay, well, I'm afraid I can tell you that this has been researched very carefully, and sleeping 4 to 5 or even 6 hours a night doesn't make you more productive. A lot of people think it gives you more time, but actually this has been studied intensively, and people who don't sleep at least 6.5, 7 hours a night, their performance declines over time on complex tasks. And here's the real zinger, they don't realize it. They think they're performing at the same level. So that's very dangerous. So I would say that's not a good way to save time. Now, having a boring breakfast. I want to tell you that I have the same breakfast every morning of my life. It's Cheerios, skim milk, and a banana. Now, why do I do that? That's because I don't care about breakfast. And I just want to routinize it. And I don't want to take any mental energy. All these tasks take mental energy. If I had to get up and say, well, am I going to have eggs? Am I going to have cereal? Am I going to have pancakes? You know, I could spend a half an hour thinking about this. I don't spend any time. I just go and eat my Cheerios, you know? And I'm suggesting this more broadly. Whatever you don't care about, whatever you can make routine, because it takes a lot of mental energy to do a lot of these things. Now, some people ask me why I eat a banana, and there really is an interesting story, is I'm a tennis player, or I try to be, and there once was a tournament here in Boston, and we had the privilege of having Yevgeny Kafelnikov stay at our house. Have anybody seen him play ever? He was about 5th in the world, he was a great player. And so, of course, we said, well, what do you want, you know, for food? He said, bananas, you know. So when I went out, bought him 6 bananas, you know. At the end of the first day, he said, sorry, not enough bananas. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, I eat 12 bananas a day. That is the key to my tennis game, because that's how I replace, it replaces part of your muscles. He has this whole theory. And so I figured, what the hell, I'll try it. And I had a banana, but it hasn't really helped my tennis game, I have to say that. And one day I thought, well, maybe I'm not having enough. And so, I tried having 4 in the morning. And I can tell you that's a bad idea. You really feel like you're walking around with something. The other thing about your day is everyone between about 1 o'clock and 4 o'clock, this is scientifically proved, your body goes down. People, different things, but your body energy goes down. And so one of the key things to do is to deal with that. And the best way, and again, there are a million studies that show this, is to exercise, even if it's only 15 minutes or half an hour. I don't mean to go out and, do slam dunks. I mean, just walk around the block for a half an hour, or take a swim, or jump rope, or something like that. Now, there are a lot of people who exercise first thing in the morning. And actually, that's not a great time to exercise because most people are pretty energized first thing in the morning. So this is a much better way to do it. And if you can't do the exercise, take a mental break. I just read a study of classical concert pianists, and they all practice between 60 and 90 minutes and then take a break. They take a mental break. And so you don't want to just keep working in this. You want to take a break if you can, an exercise break. Now, we're going to skip that one and go to meetings. So the other thing beside email that really drives people, maybe I'll talk a little about this because I do have something. So traveling. How many people here have a briefcase? So I brought some props. I never carry a briefcase. This is what I carry, a beach bag. And people, I'm telling you, it's much lighter. I realized one time when I had nothing in my briefcase how heavy it was. I had nothing. This, when you have nothing, it feels like nothing. And the other thing is you can put an incredible amount of stuff into this. So that's the first thing. The second thing is when I travel, I always go to sleep on planes. How do I do that? I take the window seat and I create a cocoon for myself. How do I do that? I have it right here. I always carry a blindfold. I carry blindfold, earplugs, and I just try to make believe like I'm in a cocoon. And when I do that, I can go to sleep. People tell me they can't sleep on planes. I really find that hard to believe. So that's what you need to do. Now that we've gotten beyond the props, let's see. Okay, meetings. So this is really a big deal. Meetings next to email and your boss, of course, are the biggest constraints on productivity. I mean, how many times have we gone to meetings that last 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours? It's ridiculous. And what goes on at those meetings that's worth 3, 4, 5 hours? The answer is very little. So here's a classic bad meeting. You walk into the meeting and somebody hands you a big stack of papers this big and says, this is what the meeting's about. Of course, you have no idea what's in the stack of papers. So then some schnook gets up, usually with PowerPoint, and spends 40 to 50 minutes telling you what the meeting's about because you didn't have these materials before. And the worst ones actually read word for word what's on their PowerPoint. And I've really come to hate that. So do you remember the old movie Network? Remember the Network? What did the guy say in that old movie Network? And that's what I say. The first time after 15 minutes reading his thing, I say to him, this is really great stuff. You're doing it. Why don't you finish up so we can have a discussion? The point of a meeting is to have a discussion, not to have you giving the PowerPoints. And if he goes on, then I urge you all to stand up and say, I'm mad as hell and I won't take this anymore. So I want to see that throughout corporate America. And so what makes for a good meeting? Well, it's actually pretty straightforward. Have an agenda and the materials sent out in advance. A lot of people say, well, I can't do it. And I said, well, then I'm not going to the meeting. If you don't send me the materials and the agenda in advance, it's useless for me to go to the meeting because all you're going to do is spend a lot of time trying to tell me what's going on at the meeting. Second thing is to have the person who leads the meeting put up short, in 10 minutes, what I call a rebuttable hypothesis. And this does go to your point. If the boss starts the meeting by saying, well, here's a very complicated problem. There are 3 alternatives, and the answer is A. Well, that's not much of a meeting, Because a meeting, the point of a meeting is to discuss things. And it's to discuss it and to, if you can't have a discussion in the meeting, why are you having a meeting? You might as well do exchange by email. So if you're going to have a meeting, you've got to have a good discussion, and you also have to have a good ending. What's a good ending? A good ending is when you say, as the leader of the group, well, what are we going to do next? And then everybody agrees that here are the steps that we want to take, here's who's going to actually do it, and here's a time frame for it. Now, the other critical thing about a meeting is that it should never go more than 90 minutes and hopefully 60 minutes. And people always tell me they need much longer. I remember a few weeks ago, I advised a small biotech company. They said they're having a board meeting and it goes from 1 to 5 o'clock. And I said, well, I'll be there from 1 to 2:30. And then I got to leave. And they said, well, you got to be there for the board meeting. I said, take my word for it. We can finish this board meeting in an hour and a half. And you know what? We did. And I have a friend in New Hampshire who has a company who's taken a much more radical approach to this. He took the chairs out of every meeting room in his company. And I can tell you that reduces the time of the meetings. No doubt about that. So you just got to resist this thing to have these very long meetings because people say, that's all I did today. I just went from one meeting to another, 5 or 6 hours, et cetera. And what did you really get accomplished? And there is a good way to have a good meeting, and hopefully we can have one. Now, yes? Yes.
Which I found very helpful.
Excuse me?
Which I found very helpful in
Good.
managing the meetings, coming from a pharma company where everybody wants to be in a meeting, but nobody wants to make a decision.
Yeah.
Many times I've found that if you work the derailers before the meeting, so there are people who like to speak, they have airtime, they're just all over the place, and they are in a position that they can command the room, and hence the other attendees in the room then take cues off of that, and the whole discussion just derails. So I found that if you socialize the content with them in advance of the meeting, and understand where they're coming from, what are some of the things or hypothesis, rebuttal that they might be thinking of. If you can prepare for that in advance, nine times out of 10, I found myself finishing on time with concrete
Well,
steps.
that's a very good suggestion. If you know that people are coming to the meeting and you know there are some people who just are, they're disruptive technologies, that's what they are. They take pride in making sure that everyone knows they're brilliant and they've been able to come up with the problem, but they don't come up with the solution. And so if you can talk to them beforehand and try to get them on the right page, that's a really good idea. Very good idea. Okay, now I'd just like to talk a little about, I call it delegation, managing your team. And what I believe, and I think it's pretty obvious, is that being an effective delegator is one of the most productive tools that you can have. But I actually have come to believe that that many people have problems being effective delegators. And in fact, many of the people who have problems are actually great producers. And part of the reason why they're not good delegators is because they're such great producers. So they tend to want to do everything themselves. And that's a big mistake. So how do you become a good delegator? Well, the first thing I found is to hire the right people. And if you have the right people who are leading your team, your direct reports, you're willing to delegate to them. And if you have the wrong people, you're in trouble. And that may seem obvious, but there are lots of HR departments, and I apologize if anyone's an HR person here and I'm disrespecting them. And it's okay for the HR department to put together the list of people, but you yourself have to interview everyone who's on your team who's a significant player. Otherwise, you will really regret it because you have no idea until you interview these people what they're really about. And then I believe you have to call the references yourself. These days, everybody is afraid to give an honest reference. You call somebody and, you know, this guy got fired because he actually, you know, beat up another employee. And they say, oh yeah, he's a good employee. Yeah, he's good. People are so afraid legally, socially to do this. So you've got to call the references and you've got to get tough. Ask questions like, well, you said this employee is good. Was he or she the best employee you ever had? Well, not quite. So you've got to have that discussion. The second thing, which goes back to the main theme, is you got to meet with your team regularly. You got to agree on objectives, and then you've got to set metrics. And once you do that, you have to let these people run. I've seen so many people, they have objectives, set metrics, the team goes off, and 2 hours later, they can't help themselves. They're at people's desks saying, oh, are you doing it the right way, this and this. The more you do that, the more people will ask you for directions. And if you set that pattern, pretty soon, everybody who works for you will not do anything until you give them detailed guidance. And if you do that, you're in big trouble. So you've really got to let them, I call it, own their own space. So I preach this in all the organizations I run. I want everybody at every level to think of themselves as running their own business. Like they're running their own business. It's up to them to figure out how to do things and take initiative and everything. It's not okay to say, I didn't do this because you didn't tell me. If it's sensible, you should be doing it. If you're really unclear, come back and ask me a question. So I'm trying to turn around that whole relationship. I'm trying to make the boss the person who provides the resources, who sets objectives, agrees on metrics, acts as a consultant, helps beat up other people outside the unit if that's necessary, but doesn't actually do the work and doesn't own the space. It's the team that owns the space. Now, if you want to do that, you've got to tolerate mistakes. Even if you have good people and they're trying hard, people are going to make mistakes. And to me, there are very different types of mistakes. If people are trying, they make in good faith a mistake, they come clean with it quickly, disclose it, and most importantly, you discuss with them how to have it not happen again, then that's okay. You ought to actually reinforce that behavior, that they are being honest about their mistakes and they're coming forward. I remember when, what's his name, Alan M. became head of Ford, he said at all these meetings, no one would ever say that anything was wrong. And finally, one executive said, we actually have a problem. No kidding, the company was almost bankrupt. We have a problem in this thing. And Alan got up and applauded the guy and gave him a standing ovation. And then people realized that they could say what the problems were. Now, when I ran Fidelity, I had a saying, let's make a new mistake, because it's okay to make a mistake and figure out how not to have it again. But you don't want to keep making the same mistake. That really is irritating. You want to make a different mistake. So these are some of the things that are crucial to actually running a team. And the last thing I talk here before we get to another chance for Q&A is meet with your boss. So we've already started this discussion. People tell me I'm actually the most productive person in the world, but my boss is a jerk. And my boss prevents me from being the most productive person in the world. And that happens all the time. Now, sometimes there are people who have good bosses and there are people who have bad bosses. But I think your boss is a very important person in your life, and whether you like him or her, you got to deal with them. And so how do you do this? Well, first, I think you have to understand what's moving your boss. What are the priorities that your bosses have? Your boss has a boss who's telling him or her what they do. So you need to understand that. You need to understand their style. And then you have to be willing to disagree constructively. So a lot of people think the boss never likes to have anyone disagree with you. Obviously, your boss thinks that, but I doubt it. Most bosses I know don't like sycophants. They like somebody who constructively, nicely comes up with a different new idea. And what I used to do is anybody would do that, I would praise them so incredibly because I wanted to hear ideas. I wanted to hear things I didn't know. What the hell if you're the boss and all the people are just telling you the same thing over and over again? It's bad. So you've really got to encourage people to disagree and disagree constructively, and that means to come up with alternatives. Now, I was at a company a few months ago, and there were several people who said that the problem is that they can't meet with their boss. Their boss is too busy to meet with them, and therefore they can't figure out what the boss wants. Well, I think that's a really big problem, and that if you're management, you ought to insist that bosses meet with their team once a week at least, in person preferably, or at least by phone. Because I'm impressed by even when people try to work together, there's always a lot of miscommunication. So you really want to be talking to your boss and really agreeing, this are my priorities, this is what I need to do. And then if problems arise, you want to talk about them, you may have to shift the priorities and these sorts of things. But if you just say your boss is a jerk and you know, I guess you could always, if he or she's really a big enough jerk, you could apply for a transfer to something else. But most of the time, if you show your boss a different way, he or she will be receptive. And the last thing I'd say about bosses, lots of people say to me is, my boss demands that I be there, this is what we said before, from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. And so you've got to try out, get your boss to try out saying, what do you want to get done this week? Let's list it. And I'm going to get it done, but I'm not going to be here 9 to 6. I'm going to get it done. And at the end of the week, we'll see whether I got it done. And if I got it done and I was here 8 to 4, or I was here this. So you've got to start getting your boss inculcated to a different thing. And in the end, bosses recognize performance. If you say you're going to do something, you agree, and you really get it done, that's the most impressive thing to bosses. So we're going to take another question and answer period right now before we go on the last part. Yes?
Previously, you were saying that you'd like to be given alternatives or solutions.
Yes, correct.
But a mistake from like a subordinate would be perhaps a problem that they thought they knew how to solve, but they obviously didn't solve it correctly, so then they come to you with a mistake and you recognize it and you guide them. But how can your subordinates know that the problem that they're dealing with is a problem that is a mistake or a problem that the boss wouldn't necessarily know how to answer anything?
Yeah, I guess I think in reality it's a little simpler than that. That is, people come to boss with a problem not because there's a mistake. They come saying the organization is not working well because of this, or everyone's in a silo, or we have bad relations, our customers hate us. That's what they come to the boss. And maybe it's true. But the boss wants to know, okay, our customers hate us. What are we going to do? Take them all on a picnic? I mean, what's our solution? Are we going to go out and meet them, or are we going to do this? People who have mistakes are people who are doing things they think are right. It just turns out not to work out. That's what I call a good faith error. So that's okay, as long as they come clean quickly and we figure out, well, what's the problem and how we can not have it happen again. But that's a very different procedure than someone saying there's a problem. By that they mean right off the bat they know it's a problem. In a mistake, they think it's reasonable, it just turns out not to work out. Yes?
Suppose you have a new matrix which will work for measuring productivity, and some of the employees, they finish the work in 2 hours. Do you allow them to moonlighting?
Well, I generally try to have people focused on the company that I'm running. But if they want to do, charitable stuff or their own artistic stuff separately, that's okay. But if you mean go off and work for another company, no. So that's not okay. I mean, really, people have different things. Some people want to pursue other stuff, maybe they want leisure, maybe they want their family, maybe they want to play golf, I don't know. But that's very different than working for another company. And that I wouldn't let people do unless they had a compelling reason, and I'd have to be convinced. Yes?
So how do you deal with a boss who has a style that's not productive within the organization that you're working in, and who makes mistakes and doesn't come clean, and those mistakes ultimately affect your product?
Well, that's a very typical complaint, and the first thing to do is to talk to your boss about it. And when you talk to your boss, don't attack the person. Say, look, in these situations, this particular way of style was counterproductive. And if you had handled it this way, it would have been better. And if your boss basically blows you off after a few times, then you might have to go to somebody else.
What if they don't blow you off and they say they're working on it, but it's like a year. And and you're still, you're in that situation, and
well, I think you have to keep coming back and say, hey, this was the same problem, so let's work on it harder. Yeah, you're ultimately coaching your boss. That's a good way to put it. Okay, I'd like to have enough time here just to talk about some three things at the end: personal skills. So these are the things that I think are really important: reading, writing, and making presentations. Why? Because that's what most of our workday is doing. So how many people here are speed readers? Okay, we have a pretty good number. So the question is, what do we mean by a speed reader? Anybody ever heard of Evelyn Wood? So Evelyn Wood, what did she do? What did she want you to do?
She wanted you to learn not to sub-vocalize and do a bunch of other things that were designed so that you could read faster.
You could read fast. So she wanted people to read like 1,000 words per minute. The problem is that you can't understand and comprehend anything if you read 1,000 words per minute. So my approach is actually the opposite of Evelyn Wood. I say read fewer words per minute, but read the right words. And how do we know what the right words? It depends on what your purpose in reading is. And so before you pick up something, a memorandum, chapter, a book, the question is, why are you reading it? Sometimes you might be reading it because you want to know the general thesis. Sometimes you might be reading it because you want to know detailed facts. You ought to be clear what it is that you're reading for. And then I urge people, do not read the beginning, middle, and end. Read the beginning, the end, and then decide whether what this person is saying is really within your purpose. And if it's not, don't read any more. If it's partially within your purpose, then skim through the article to do this. And I can tell you, I run a lot of, in these classes that I give, we run a lot of different experiments and stuff. The difference between the effective readers and the readers who aren't effective, like on a short article, is the difference between 3 minutes and 12 minutes. When you think about that, you multiply that across the year, that's huge. So I read the Boston Globe every day in 5 minutes. You know how? Because I read it only for two purposes. Anything happened locally, politically, and what happened to sports teams. I don't read any other part of the paper. I don't read the economic part of the Boston Globe, it's trash. Why would I read the Boston Globe? To learn about economics in Europe or, international finance, They don't even have anybody in an international office anymore. So that's just a good example. So you can make yourself into a good reader, but don't confuse being a fast reader with being an effective reader. Now, the next one is writing. How many speed writers do we have here? Well, we have one. So tell me about your being a speed writer. How did you become a speed writer?
I had a boss who told me, just give me the key point at the top. If you want to put a lot of detail below, do that.
Okay, so that's an important thing about being a good writer, a speed writer, is effectively no one wants to read a 10-page memo. I mean, the reality is, I shouldn't say no one, but 99 out of 100 people don't want it. They want to know the key points in the executive summary. So if you can't do that, then you're not writing for good readers. And so that's critical. The second thing is you ought to write the introduction and then conclusions, assuming that people are going to read the introduction and then go to the conclusion so they can see what it is that you say in your conclusion and what are the conclusions, whether it's worth it for them to continue to read. Now, the other thing I want to ask is, how many people write an outline before they write? Okay, so I only see about 20%. Next year when I'm here, we're not allowing you to come back to the Alumni Association unless you pledge that you've written outlines. Because I'm telling you, I'm a speed writer. I mean, I publish this year maybe 12, 15 articles. You cannot be an effective writer unless you write outlines. When you think about it, writing is two distinct processes. You have to think what your line of argument is, and then you have to translate it. Now, the translation part is pretty hard, even if you know what your line of argument is. But if you don't know what your line of argument is, your translation part is like impossible. Because like in the middle, you don't know how to translate because you're lost in your own argument. So that's the key to an outline. And if you write the outline, hopefully you've done the thinking part. You've thought through the line of your argument, and then you can look at the translation problem and see how you can best communicate it. So I'm missionary when it comes to to outlines, and that's the basic thing. And then I agree with the man up there is keep it short, have an executive summary, clear intros and conclusions, and then what I call write so that the reader could read off the tops of the paragraph. Have a sentence at the beginning of the paragraph that sort of alerts the reader what's in the paragraph, and so they can decide whether they want it. Yes?
So I think it's Mark Twain, maybe it's somebody else said that, if I had more time, I'm sorry this letter is so long, but if I had more time, I would have been shorter.
Right.
So, there's like almost a contradiction around this whole speed writing thing. If you're really going to do speed writing to write for speed readers, it's actually going to take more time.
Well, it may take more time in the sense of you've got to do an outline and then you got to do it. But what you're doing is so much more effective. So we don't want to talk so much about speed writing as effective writing. But I'll tell you this, and I published this year probably 2 op-eds in the Wall Street Journal, 2 op-eds in the FT, and they give me 800 words. So one of the subjects was the premier in China, his new approach to all of economic policies that he announced. 800 words, right?
Not much.
Yeah. So what it forces you to do is really get down to what's important. And actually, if you have to write 800 words, it's a discipline that really forces you to learn how to write effectively. Now, there are lots of people in academia who don't know how to write less than 50,000 words with 200 footnotes. The question is anyone reading them? And if you were forced to write on 800 words, you would actually figure out quickly, it would sort of force you to do what you say. What's the essence here? What are the key points? Why am I reading this? What are the key points and where are we going? Yes?
I usually try to put it short, but sometimes you have to write a one-page memo.
Yeah, I'm not against a one-page memo. I'm against a 10-page memo.
These days, even with one page, you want to make sure that you see something big. But what I usually do when I send this type of emails or memos, I write, look, it's long, but it's important.
Well, okay, that's good. The answer, whether 1 page or a half a page is the right answer, it depends on the subject. Sometimes, 1 page is necessary. Sometimes it's not. But I guess if your readership, you have to urge them to go all the way to read the 1 page. I think they've been a little spoiled because they shouldn't be required to read a 5 or 10-page memo, but I think everybody should read the executive summary, and the executive summary reasonably can be 1 page. So maybe you're just dealing with people, well, probably with emails, they're used to a lot shorter sort of stuff, that sort of thing.
It works.
It works.
To say it's long, it's important.
Okay, yeah, well, that's good to say it's important. Yeah, that's good. Because a lot of people, we're getting so much email, you don't know what's important. I like that. I like that. Yes?
You usually write at the same time, 3:30 p.m., that's when you're...
No, I write. I write whatever strikes me. Some people write well in the morning, some people write well in the evening, some people in the afternoon. That's just pretty arbitrary. I just try to keep the sequence of the day. But now we'll go to another arbitrary thing about giving a talk. So here we have an empirical example of giving a talk, me talking to you today. So what are the things? Get there early. So I talked to these people right here about what they had come here for, because I never know until I come what the audience actually wants. And you never know what the audience is going to be like. You don't know what the people are. You don't know what the room is like. So come early and figure out what the audience is and what they want. And that's why I believe strongly, this is another missionary statement on my part, never write out your text, never memorize your speech, because it might be the wrong one. The audience, you might have prepared this brilliant speech on U.S.-Russian relations, but actually it turns out everybody's interested in U.S.-Chinese relations. So you're going to give the speech on U.S.-Russian relations? I'll tell you, and this is a great story. So what's his name? James, who's the political consultant who's married to James Carville, right. So I once had to talk after James Carville and before lunch. And this was in Phoenix, Arizona, and lunch meant box lunches on your golf cart. So this was a pretty tough speaking slot. And James Carville is one of the great speakers of all time. I mean, I was in awe of him, and he is really wicked funny. And he has this sort of, he's from Louisiana. Did you know that he comes from Carville, Louisiana, where his great-great-grandfather was the postmaster? I mean, these are important facts to know. And I just give you a sense of how funny he is. Here's what story he tells. He was not a very good student, according to him. And he went to Louisiana State. And after his first semester, he comes back and he shows his dad his report card, which has 3 F's and 1 C. And his father looks at it and he says, James, I think I know what your problem is. And James says, what's that? You're concentrating too much on one subject. So, I thought I was going to be talking about, financial dynamics, this and this. And I realized, the crowd was going wild and stuff. So I got up there and introduced myself as Billy Bob Pozen. And, we went from there and everybody had a good time. So that's an important thing is you got to essentially be responsive to your audience. And you don't know your audience. And so most of the time when I give a speech, and I give a lot of them, is what I do is I'll do this with 5 points. And I'll say to myself, these are the 5 points I want to make. Sometimes I'll write out the introductory sentence just so I can get going. And then I'll write out the 4 or 5 points. Then I can be flexible. Then I know what I'm going to do, So I can be flexible and responsive to the audience. And another thing is, and this goes to your point on the boss, is a lot of times when someone is like an eminent person, they get up, people are afraid to laugh, They think, oh, this is a very serious person, So that's why I started off by saying that he forgot to tell you about my role as a stand-up comedian, because then you think, well, it's a great resume, this guy's just a normal person. And then people will laugh. A lot of people, especially CEOs, people are afraid to laugh when they're talking, They think, well, God, what this says is like, from the Bible or at least the Talmud or something, So we got to hang on every word. And the other thing is to not speak too long. Again, here I was required to speak for an hour and a half, which is pushing it. Generally, we have about 80 minutes, but we're doing that. And you have to leave time for Q&A. And before my closing slide, I'm going to take more questions if anyone wants to ask me them. Yes?
Materials should be sent ahead of
Yes.
meetings. In your case, when do you usually choose to read that material? Is it just before the meeting, in which case you schedule that time? Or do you...
Well, the answer is it depends. I mean, if I get it the day before, I can read it the night before. If I know I'm going to have some free time in the morning, I could read it then. Yeah, so if the meeting, if it comes at night and the meeting's not till 4 o'clock, et cetera. But that's an important thing is when you send the stuff in advance, you have to run the meeting as if everyone has read it. If you don't do that, then no one's ever going to read it. So you don't start the meeting by explaining what's all in the materials, because then people can get away without reading it. You run the meeting and you tell people, I'm assuming you've all read it. And then the next time they really read it.
They don't schedule time for themselves to read it.
Well, that's an interesting idea. Maybe if there was a better executive summary of the materials, maybe they'd read that. Yes?
I'd like to ask for your recommendations from experience about the topics that you've talked about, delegating, running the meeting, preparing the materials for board meetings.
For board meetings? Well, board meetings are a whole separate deal, and these days there's, I teach a course on corporate boards and governance. There's so many rules and regulations and this and this. So I guess I'm going to say I wrote a piece called Toward More Professional Boards in Harvard Business Review 3 or 4 years ago, and that sort of summarizes my view about basically don't have a lot more legal rules, change the process, the culture, the way people go about being on boards. So that's my short answer to that long question. Other questions? We fading here? Okay, well, let me just end with this slide and talks about going home. So this is one of the things I'm proudest about. I've run some large organizations, but I would say 4 out of 5 nights, weekday nights, I got home at 7 p.m. and had dinner with my wife and kids. And I'll freely admit that my wife was a psychotherapist, so she had a lot more flexibility in time, and she was the one who took the kids to the doctors and if things happened, and she did play the major role at home. So I had that privilege. But I did get home every night at 7 o'clock, and looking back upon it, I'm really glad that I did. My kids are all grown up now, and you know, if you miss that time, you miss a lot. Now, I'd say most of the CEOs I deal with don't get home every night at 7 p.m. In fact, I've met so many of them that are on the road like 200 days a month, 200 days a year. That's really incredible. And a lot of people tell me they have to stay late. They have to stay late every night. In New York especially, you find all these people who never leave the office till 10 p.m. And they say there's an emergency, they say they have to do it, they say the boss requires it, et cetera. So I believe strongly that you've got to have some work-life balance, and this is an important component of it. And I think it's not only good for you as a person, but it actually helps your work life. Why? It's a mental break. A lot of times I was struggling with a problem, come home, have dinner, play ping pong with my kids, let them beat me, you know? Or if they were teenagers, let them yell and scream about everything that I did to embarrass them the last day, you know? And then, say 10 o'clock, I'd go back to my home office, and all of a sudden, I'd figure out the answer to the problem. It would come to me because I had sort of gotten that mental break. But if you are going to do this, the key is that before you enter that room, before you enter your house, you actually have to do all your emails, all your phone mails, and get to the point where you're really going to shut it all down and really focus on your family for that 2 hours or whatever it is. Because if you really want to tick off your family, you come in at 7 p.m. and at 7:10 you get a call. That will really tick them off. Or at 7:15 you decide you have to write an email. So I actually sometimes park my car and sit in the car, even if I'm going to be late for 7 p.m. and do all this stuff. So at least when I come in, I know I'm ready for that. So I think that, we go back to your point here, you had said before, is what does it mean to be productive? It means to get more done for the things that are important to you. So I don't know what's important to each of you. For some of you, it might be just work, getting to be a CEO quickly. For others, it might be to have a satisfactory job, but also to bring up a family. For others, it might be to start a new company. For some, it might be to become a great tennis player. I don't know. But the key I'm saying is, whatever your objective is, don't think of it in terms of the number of hours you're putting in. Think about how you can get as much as possible accomplished relative to that objective. And the way to do that is, first of all, to prioritize your objectives, and second of all, to have metrics by which you can figure out whether you've been successful. So I always like to say to my team at the end of these weekly meetings, how are we going to know whether we've succeeded in achieving these goals that we've all agreed on at the end of the week? And if we have good metrics, we'll all know whether that's right or not. So I'm going to stop there and hope you have a good rest of your weekend. Take care.